guest judge with TAO a few weeks ago during our Ag Innovation Challenge down in Independence, and we know she's passionate about data transparency and utilizing information to improve the lives of Oregonians. All right, Kathryn, welcome, and we'll dive right into questions. So as Oregon's first Chief Data Officer, how would you describe your role?
I would first describe it by learning how to use an unmute button. There's been a lot of that as we adjust. So the short answer is that I'm here to help guide the state through learning to manage its data strategically and as an asset. I think the longer, more detailed conversation is that the state as a whole is really learning about what it means to recognize that their data is a strategic asset, meaning that it has value and needs to be actively stewarded, needs to be managed. We need to make sure that we're working to realize tangible and intangible benefits associated with it, and that we have to make sure that there are protections in place around essentially treating it like an investment. We either pay for it or collect it as a byproduct or use it in our decision making, and we should make sure that we know what we have, know how secure it is, know how to protect it, and make sure that it's being used to the fullest capability that we can utilize it. So a lot of my work is focused on education and outreach with agencies, talking about how we proactively manage the quality and integrity of our data. And I've also been given some statutory mandates associated with things like data governance, open data, data sharing, really making sure that we're utilizing data in an effective manner.
Great. So you mentioned some of the statutory mandates and some of the work you're doing across the various agencies. I'm wondering, how would you describe some of the key priorities for your office right now?
So a lot of what we have to do at the state is foundational work. Oregon in particular is very decentralized in how it manages its information and how it creates information. So over the past year, I've spent a lot of work really building relationships with state agencies, bringing them to the table and sort of forming my coalition of the willing, I guess you would call it, with regards to agencies that are really proactive and excited about data management. We're also looking at some kind of cultural shifts associated with information sharing and data sharing and how we learn to interact with each other as agencies and even business units within state agencies. So I have about 4 or 5 kind of key priorities that have really carried me through this work. One is really a foundational enterprise data inventory. So making sure that all state agencies have an inventory that's in a similar format, making sure that that enterprise inventory is discoverable. So making it publicly accessible through our data.oregon.gov, which is our open data platform, and working with agencies to look at how to effectively inventory data. For some agencies, that's incredibly simple. They tell me I can count the number of data assets I have on one hand. Other agencies, you have really large scale initiatives, you have hundreds of thousands of data assets, or you even also have agencies that are either paying for data or paying for the collection of data and management of data. So they've got more detailed and more complex data inventories. Another piece is really using those inventories to get data governance built within the agencies. So making sure that we have a framework for how we manage data, making sure that we have policies and planning documents and guidance for the state as we look to manage data as more of a centralized or strategic asset. And then also updating some of our older materials and guidance. So for example, our data classification policy is about 10 years old. So looking at refreshing some of that to make sure that there's roles and accountability and structure in place so that we're actively working to manage our data effectively. And that really builds upon that inventory effort. I also currently have an advisory group that's working on a data strategy. So this is the entire kind of framework and principles and practices for how we as a state are committing to managing our data. Those are the behaviors that we're trying to cultivate, the areas that we're willing to invest in or resource, and then any sort of kind of sustaining efforts that we want to make as we manage data. And I think in particular, this is also where we'll see tackling of things like ethics, privacy, how we want to handle things like artificial intelligence and machine learning as a state, and really trying to come up with centralized principles and practices for how we do those things. We also have a data sharing initiative. So we're still absent a chief privacy officer at the state level, which means that privacy is a decentralized, again, kind of understanding, and each agency has their own regulatory constraints or their own federal requirements. So we're looking at what kind of work is currently being done with data sharing and really trying to get an inventory of all of these different complexities as agencies share data. And then, as I mentioned, an open data program. So this is, you know what you have, you know how secure it is. What can we do to make data that's of high value publicly accessible for our constituents?
Great. And, you know, it was excellent hearing some of the ways in which you're thinking about, you know, both what you're dealing with at the state in terms of the status quo, and then how you move things forward. And the decentralized nature of government is always a challenge in Oregon, state and local. One thing that I wanted to ask you about is data is increasingly very valuable, central and core to operations and nonprofits and universities, education systems, businesses. And I'm wondering, what role does the state have in ensuring equitable access to data assets? You mentioned a bit about open data. Is that sort of part and parcel of a larger strategy there?
So yes, I think equitable access is a really complicated issue when you deal with data, because you're talking about something that already has an access barrier associated with that, either because there's technical literacy that's assumed, or there's even just technical infrastructure that's assumed, right? So when it comes to publishing open data, we make that available on a website, but at the same time, you have to make assumptions about the constituent base, that they have access to a computer, that they know where the data is. And then if you're talking about raw tabular data, that the data is contextualized in a way that doesn't just mean, okay, the data's there, it's available, but that it's also accessible, meaning that I, as a layperson, have either been given the tools or been given the presentation layer to allow me to make sense of what I'm seeing. So from an equitable access standpoint, I think a lot of the opportunities that we're looking at leveraging are things like California and Washington have what they call an open data through Main Street program, which focuses on actually providing curriculum for reference librarians in providing and recommending open data for people. So you're looking at a population who maybe doesn't come directly from the civic technology community or come directly from that context of open data, or already knowing what open data is and how to use it. Another piece that I'm looking at as I educate agencies is reminding them that they don't have to publish in just one format. I think it's important to have a single data set act as a system of record. You don't want duplication, but at the same time, you can build different presentation layers and options on top of that. So for an example, I have a transparency program that's in the process of revamping its website. So if you look for Oregon Transparency Program, you can find that site, and there's some data associated with things like expenditures, revenue. There's also some educational service district data, but that data at present is not necessarily in the most usable or parsable format, right? It's like hundreds of thousands of expenditures. Oh my goodness, how do I interact with that if I want to just see a general awareness of how agencies are spending money, or get a good picture of what kind of budget buckets they might be spending out of? So we've been talking about adding things like visualizations or interactive options so folks can click through and access those things. At the same time, also being sensitive to the fact that we do have other, you know, website accessibility standards that we want to make sure that we're conforming to. So I think there's a lot of opportunity when it comes to training and managing people to kind of look at all of these different options for making data accessible. And then I think when we talk about equity or equitable access, I think the other piece that we as a state have not necessarily fully leveraged is actually community feedback when we start creating, collecting, or using data in the first place. So one of the principles that our data strategy work group is really looking at right now is how do we include inclusion and equity into our principles when it comes time to either design for a community that's being served, or look at how we collect data on behalf of people who participate in certain programs. How do we make sure that they're also understanding the types of information that we might collect about them, why we collect it, how we're collecting it, or what in particular we're going to use that data for? I think at times people feel like I give my information to the government and it goes into a black box. So figuring out, you know, how agencies can actually be more proactive in engaging the communities they serve about their data.
Great. Another question I had was, in all of your efforts, do you see an opportunity to leverage some of the expertise and infrastructure that exists in local governments in the state using sort of more of a shared services model? And similarly, or I'll go with the compound question here, are there other opportunities for collaboration, say, with the private sector as well?
Yeah, so I think overall, in terms of opportunities for collaborating with local governments, one of the missions that I really brought to the table was increasing data sharing between local, county, special service district governments and agencies in the state. We have counties and cities who we rely on as a state agency to administer programs or collect information on behalf of our constituents. And then we collect the data and we use it, but they may not necessarily have that same access. I think there's also opportunity for things like federated sharing of data assets. So can we create a regional data hub around certain topics? And I know we've talked about this in the Agriculture Tech Challenge, but if the state brings certain data assets to the table and the city and county bring certain data assets to the table, and maybe there's also private industry that could be engaged, could we pick specific problems or strategic areas and look at resolving issues within those strategic areas? So I think there's a lot of opportunity, especially with pooling of shared data assets. I think the state hasn't really explored public-private partnerships much either. I'd like to see a little more conversation around that, and then how we use data at the state level to help enable things like smart cities initiatives.
Excellent. We've got a lot of questions submitted from folks. This is actually, I think, one of the most popular webinars or online events we've done in the last month.
Data is exciting. There's a ton of opportunity here for how the state uses data. And I think we're still really in the learning and exploration phase of just, oh my gosh, we have so much stuff. We have so many opportunities. So I'm excited to see that people care.
Yeah, it's great. I had a chance earlier this week to sit down with the CIO from Portland General Electric, John Kochevar, and he's also a board member at TAO. And turns out he's on this call as well. And he asked a question about, what kind of data attributes and trends are you tracking at the state level at the moment, especially as it relates to the current economic environment? And are there any forecasts or other trends that you'd be willing to share?
Well, so I will say, in terms of, again, looking at how decentralized the state is, I'm not necessarily in the business of being like a chief analytic officer. I will say, if you track the Oregon Employment Department, they actually are very, I would say, proactive and transparent with how they share data. So they have a website that is qualityinfo.org, and they've done a really good job of making sure that they share things like workforce unemployment trends. They've also been trying to continually add extra data associated with sort of COVID and how we're managing it. And I will say, we also, our Joint Information Center, the group that's been responsible for our centralized COVID response, has really been working to make sure that the data that they collect and use, if it can be made publicly available, they make it available through our ArcGIS online platform. So if you go to our Oregon.gov website and search either for ArcGIS online or for COVID, you should find a website that's associated with, they call them hub pages. So they're centralized kind of groupings of different data resources and visualizations. So a lot of that is the data that's been amassed by our emergency department, OHA, as they share that effort and response. Other agencies, you can see data about things like PPE shipments, county hospital data, et cetera. So I think those are some really good opportunities to kind of see and explore with the different data that's being used to make decisions right now.
Another question we had was from Jeff Petrie down in Eugene, the city of Eugene. And so he's doing a lot of work right now around data warehousing and smart community and data science programs. And he's wondering, is there a data work group of sorts that local governments can connect with your office in?
So we haven't looked at creating like a regional data work group. I'm definitely interested in exploring that possibility. I know what I've been doing is trying to build relationships just with local governments as I've been able to make contact with them. And I am working on trying to build a data stewardship council for state agencies, but that's in service of getting them to identify a lead data steward. But if there's interest in creating a local data work group, I'm definitely happy to have that conversation. I think it'd be interesting to see how we can help provide data governance support to cities and counties, not just state agencies.
Excellent, excellent. There's a related question as well from Nathan Phillips. So he asked if the state's considering a data warehouse as a possible future offering.
I think there's interest, but I think there's interest in service to specific use cases. So for example, we do have a state longitudinal data system that serves as a central data warehouse for education data and employment data. So it's actually used for kind of tracking students through the K-12 system to see if we can learn more about workforce outcomes associated with specific school performance factors. There isn't necessarily capacity for the state to build a single data warehouse for all data. What we've been exploring right now are the idea of data trusts, so that specific agencies will share data with one another in a data warehouse associated with some sort of trust. So that might be either, again, like a nonprofit public partnership, or we have some integrated data sharing that happens with OHSU associated with early childhood indicators and outcomes. So we have these pockets of data sharing specific to certain use cases. I think if we were ever to look at a fully centralized state data warehouse that we would use for decision making, we'd probably have to do a lot of work, both on the technology modernization end, and then I think even too on the cultural management end. Getting 84 agencies to pool data in a disciplined and orderly fashion, I think would be a very long and complicated process, but there's definitely interest in and a big focus with the state agencies on that power of integrated data. So there's been bits and pieces as they relate to things like education or early childhood outcomes.
One thing that's been interesting right now to follow in the media has been a discussion about sort of that push and pull, the tension inherent in data privacy on the one hand, and sort of what data can do for purposes of responding to a crisis, right? So you've got the COVID-19 related issues going on, and with contact tracing and other types of things going on. How do you balance or strike a balance between some of the privacy related issues that are inherent in that, and then sort of the power or availability of what data can do in a crisis?
Mm-hmm. So that's incredibly complicated and not just associated with data. I think it's really interesting. I was reading a paper by the Electronic Frontier Foundation on privacy issues that are up and coming in 2020 and beyond. And one of them had to do with biometric tracking, and then suddenly we hear, well, there might be the possibility of using body scanners to detect fevers in citizens. So I think COVID and some of this pandemic response has really brought a lot of these considerations to the forefront. With how we use data and privacy specifically, I can't necessarily speak to all of these other innovative technologies. One of the things that I've looked at is, can we as a state commit to guardrails or boundaries, or at least ethical consideration? I think in particular, the state is not necessarily leveraging machine learning or AI a lot, but there is interest in eventually using our data for materials with applications such as that. So what we've talked about are things like making sure that process is in and of itself incredibly transparent. So if we, the state, are going to use an algorithm to predict certain population behavior, that we're very transparent that these are the factors that we're looking at, this is the behavior that we're trying to predict, and this is how we use that information. I think where we kind of fall, Kathy O'Neill has a book called Weapons of Math Destruction. So where I think we fall into that weapon of math destruction territory is when we start using those inputs or outputs to make individual level decisions. So much of the integrated data that we at the state use is matched and then immediately has all of the private information stripped from it. So it's not necessarily about a single human intervention. It's about saying, okay, well, overall, we're seeing this population trend take place. So making sure that we're being really cautious in the decisions that we make, and also cautious in the ways that we use that information. And I think there's a lot of capacity for, as I said, immediately stripping PII from certain data sets so that you're working with aggregated data instead of working with individual level information.
So there are definitely some questions we got that were more related to, say, something that Christian Taylor, the state labor economist, might be kind of throwing up on the quality data website and on a weekly or every other week basis with regard to economic trends in data. But I'm wondering, if there are certain larger picture trends you're seeing across any of the state agencies with regard to internal operations. Like, are there any sort of disruptions that you've seen happen with respect to COVID-19 as people have gone, say, more remote? And how's your office addressed some of that? And I think that talking to a lot of companies that we work with more people going remote, they've had to think about data governance and security issues in a different way with people accessing infrastructure remotely. How have you all addressed that going forward?
So we especially within EIS, so I'm within Enterprise Information Services, I report to the state CIO, so we're very, while my position is not necessarily specifically IT focused, I come from an IT shop, and I think the areas that I've really seen some excellent security response and excellent coordination of effort is that when we understood that work from home was going to become the new norm for a while, we really looked at leveraging multi-factor authentication and additional security protections. We also used this time to really leverage areas like Office 365. So while we talk a lot about data, I think the natural evolution of that moves further into areas like information governance and knowledge management. So not just, do I have the right data to make decisions, but am I then also sharing that information in a useful way? Am I making sure that there's appropriate communication and succession planning within my agency? And is there clear understanding of those kind of accountabilities and information within my organization as a whole? So I think what I've seen is some really cool leveraging of new technologies, and especially things like cloud-based document sharing, to create a much more collaborative and open work environment. And I think something that also, like on a very simple end, leads to better management of things like version control, deduplication, eliminating redundancy. So I think we've seen kind of a quicker shift to efficiency in certain areas. I'm really looking forward to this because I have some developer resources that I'm hoping to hire for, and I think this is a great opportunity for me to think, what would it mean to bring on either a fully remote or a mostly remote team member? So I have one coder in my office, and the thought was, okay, well, how would you best interact with someone who maybe was only in the office one day a week? And I think this has been a really cool opportunity to see that there's actually a culture that's already built. And as that challenge has kind of emerged, we've really seen agencies rise to that challenge.
So we're just past the 5-minute mark. And I think what's always interesting is when we can kind of draw inspiration from different examples and best practices elsewhere around the country. And given your previous experience in Austin, Texas, I'm wondering, as you're thinking about your role as the state's first chief data officer, do you look to other states right now, or even cities, in terms of, wow, they've got it really figured out in terms of their data governance and policies and infrastructure? Like, what are the states you look to, or cities, as model exemplars of where you want to go with Oregon?
Oh my gosh, almost all of the states that have a CDO have some element that is really interesting or really effective in their program. So I'm actually part of the state CDO network. So we have a monthly call, we have a group listserv. We've actually had several calls related to COVID response and sort of, do we have best practices that we're sharing? I think in particular, California, both San Francisco, the city and county of San Francisco have a really mature data governance and data management and stewardship program. A lot of their documentation is really, I would say, clear and understandable. And I think they've put a lot into making a very cohesive program that incorporates all of these aspects of data governance, like quality and integrity, making sure that you've inventoried things. California as a whole has actually just hired San Francisco's former CDO. So she and I have had a few calls to kind of connect and talk more about what she's seeing within the state of California. Connecticut actually also has some really strong data governance functions that are happening within their CDO. They're actually on their second CDO, but they've had a chief data officer position for about 7 or 10 years. So they're one of the first states to have a CDO. And I think they've really made sure that there's a lot of public input in how they manage data, and they've been able to build some really great partnerships between, I think there's like a Connecticut data collaborative, so you've got more of a civic data community that's also helping to drive the releasing of public data to say, this is what constituents are interested in, or this is the problem that we're looking to solve within the community, and these are the data sets that we need. So building that feedback loop so that the open data that's being released is really valuable.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you, Kathryn, for taking some time to spend with us this morning. We have a ton of other questions that we'll try to get to you, and whether it's you or members of your team that may be able to kind of over time share some written responses to those, we'll make sure to post those in our online forum afterwards. But really appreciate your time, and we hope to continue the dialogue, which has been ongoing with you all, and look forward to additional collaboration with your office going forward. Yeah, and we've asked this question of everyone, which is any sort of last anecdotes or stories that you might want to share with people about any embarrassing or awkward moments in this virtual world that we now find ourselves?
This actually, of all the questions I was kind of thinking about, is probably the hardest, because I'm generally a pretty awkward person. So I feel like my life always has a funny or awkward moment. And I don't know that adding Zoom has necessarily changed that. My spouse is also home with me. So there have definitely been a few times where you'd like see a figure darting in the background to retrieve something from the office. But I don't necessarily know that I have any specific one. I definitely jumped in on a conference call to listen to my colleagues' children have a fight, but I think that's pretty normal these days.
I think you're right. Well, thank you for sharing that and for sharing your time with us this morning. We appreciate it. So I hope you have a great weekend, and thank you to everyone who joined us this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks.